Welcome to a new episode in my Node-RED tutorial video series, and today I want to talk about how you can use the Node-RED context. I think this is an important topic, especially for those who come to Node-RED who don't have previous programming experience, and they say the Node-RED interface where you have boxes and then you connect them with wires, and then you just assume that you can do a lot of things without knowing too much about programming and have any programming knowledge. And I think this is certainly true, but then you are also missing some of the concepts that are required in order to do certain applications. And for those, I think, especially in the Node-RED environment, when you deal with messages, then you have to have some sort of way to store the information between messages. If you want to remember the value of a previous message or a different message that I want to use when you are processing a completely different message. And this is what the context is used for. So what we are going to learn in this video is you are going to learn how you can store data between messages. So how you can store part of the data or your entire message, and this is what you use the context for. You understand the differences between different contexts, and also this is also called the scope of the context. We are also going to talk about various storage options, so how you can make your context persistent. So for example, store information so it doesn't get lost when you restart your Node-RED instance. And I'm going to show you quite a few different examples. So some of them are going to be very, very basic examples. So for example, how you can calculate the minimum and the maximum of the values that are coming through in messages, or count the number of messages, or how you can implement some timer-based motion detector or a simple thermostat. So some of these are going to be like basic examples that you might be able to do using a node, and some of these are going to be like more the the home automation type of scenarios. Also, I'm going to later on go into some examples how you use the context in a function node, so when you are writing your own JavaScript code. And I also have a couple of examples for you when you should not use the context, or the type of scenarios where the context is not a good place to store the information. There's going to be a lot of content in this video, so if you want to do it in pieces, I have broken up the video into various sections so you can see the chapters in the progress bar, and also you can find links in the video description. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Node-RED is all about processing messages. So everything that we do in Node-RED is an event-based, and the event is whenever a message comes from, let's say, a sensor or some external device or a web request. And when these messages are coming through, we are processing those single messages, and we don't necessarily know about any of the other messages or the previous message that are coming through in the same flow as well. And this is why we need the context, because we need to store this information. So for example, I need to store the last data because, for example, I need to tell whether the data that I have received is either bigger than or smaller than the previous one. So maybe if I need to decide something based on the value, whether it's trending up or trending down, or I just want to calculate the minimum or the maximum, or count the number of messages that I received, let's say in the last hour. And this is what the context is for. So first of all, what I'm going to show you, but before that, let me just move my face out of the way. So in the left navigation, or in the left bar, we usually use either the debug or the status information. But if you come here, there is one which is called the context data, and this is where we can view the various contexts. And we have three different contexts. There is one which is called the global, there is a flow, and the node. So first of all, I'm just going, and in this example, I'm going to use the flow mainly. And the difference between the flow and the global is that whatever you store in a flow variable can only be used or is only visible for nodes in the same flow. So I'm going to use everything in the flow because this example is all related to the context, and I don't feel like some of the other nodes need to have this information. But if you have a global information, for example, let's say you have a light sensor, and then based on that light sensor, you decide whether it's daytime or nighttime, and you want this information to be used in multiple flows, then you put it into the global area, so it will be visible for all your flows. But we are going to see these examples a little bit later. And the node is sometimes special. It's only used by the function nodes, but I'm going to talk about that later. Let's take an example. Maybe it's going to be easier to understand this. So here I have a couple of inject nodes where I can send in various numbers, 10, 20, 25, 30. Let's assume that these are temperatures that are coming from a temperature sensor. And so I have the information coming through here in the flow, and I want to save the value because I just want to have the last value always visible in the system or always stored in the system. So I can do this very simply using the change node, and I can say like I want to set, and you can see here that usually we have either a flow or, well, we usually use the message, because if you want to use the message topic or a message payload, but you also have the option to select flow or global. So again, as I mentioned, this, if you select flow, it's going to store the value in the flow, so it's visible in this flow only. If I put it into global, it's visible everywhere. And I have to specify the name of the value. And let's say this is the last value. And so I want to store the message payload in this last value variable or context variable. So I deploy my flow and nothing is happening. And if I inject, so I send the data in, and it is getting stored in the flow. But we don't really see that right now. But if I come here and I refresh, then I can see, oh, let me just delete some of my earlier ones so they don't disturb us for the time being. And with this, I also show you how you can delete the flow variables, sorry, the context variables. So if I send number 10 again and I refresh, I can see that the last value is 10. And if I send the data 20, now it is getting overwritten by 20. So again, you have the option to store this value, and it is available in your flow. So now the message has been processed, but this value is still available in the flow. So what can we do with it? For example, we can have an inject node, and then we can get this value. So using simply a change node again, I can say that now I want to put my flow variable, which is called last value, and I want to put it into the message.payload. So if I execute this, and then I send the result in a debug. So if I execute this, now you can see that I managed to retrieve my last value, and it's here. So if I send in 30 and I get the last value again, it shows 30. So again, you have a value, you process the incoming, let's say, temperatures, but you have a separate process, let's say every hour or every 5 minutes, you want to do something based on the last temperature. So you put it into a flow variable, and then you retrieve it when you process it using an inject node. So that's the simplest example. But we can do something with this last value as well. So if I connected this to this change node, sorry, this switch node, then I can determine the change of the value. So now I can compare the message.payload into the flow last value variable, and whether it's bigger or smaller, I can change the value, saying that the value is lower or the value is higher. So, and then I send the result into a debug as well. So the last value that I sent in was 25. So if I say 20, then, well, nothing happens. And actually, I made a mistake here, because you see, we are checking what was the last value, but then we are setting the last value at the same time. So now probably what happens is this gets executed first, and then, because these are always the same, nothing really happens, because we have a condition for less than or greater than. So what I can do is I can add a small delay node here. Let's say I set it to 100 milliseconds. And that's just going to be enough. So this gets executed first before the value gets stored. I mean, I could have done it in a different way. It's not that elegant, but I think it's going to work. So now let's check the last value. So I go back to the context. It is 20. So if I go to the debug and I say 25, that's higher. If I say 10, it's lower. So now this works. We are able to compare the context value with the current value. So you can do something with that. In the next example, I wanted to calculate the minimum and the maximum value. So again, let's assume that these are temperatures, but you are interested in what is the maximum and the minimum value in a particular day. Then you can, again, just do a simple switch to say that if the payload is less than the flow.min, so minimum, then I want to store the flow, I want to put the current value into the minimum flow variable. So if I do like, I don't know, 10, then we can again check the flow variable. It shows that the last value was 10. It doesn't show the mean yet. And this is because here we are comparing the current value with the flow variable, but the flow variable doesn't exist. So it cannot compare something to something, well, a value to something which doesn't exist. But we can help with that because we can initialize the minimum value. So here I put the minimum value to 1000. So now you can see that it is 1000. So as soon as I receive the data, now it is getting reset to 10. And if I send 30, then nothing happens. It's still 20 because, it's still 20 because that's the lowest value. But if I say send 10, then now the minimum is changes to 10. And of course you can change it to, you can create another one. So if the current value is bigger than the flow max, then we are going to store the max value. So we put the current payload to max, and also we need to initialize the max value. So let's say that the flow.max, and let's put it to minus 1000. So it would definitely get overwritten whenever we receive the first set of data. So if I do set, then we have the max and a min. Sorry, I should have done this to a number minus 1000 again, just to be sure, so we are comparing numbers and numbers. Okay, so this is good now, minus 1000 and 1000. So if I say 25, that's the new minimum and the maximum. And if I send 20, then the minimum is 20, the maximum is still 25. So let's do the extremes, 10 and 30. So now we have the minimums 10 and the maximum is 30. And of course, if I send 25, then nothing happens because our calculation works. So this would now calculate the minimum and the maximum temperatures of the day. And of course, let's say you can set this inject node to execute every midnight, and then it's just going to reset the values every midnight. Of course, then you need to wait for the first data to reset the 1000 and the minus 1000, but maybe you can find another way to reset the first value to the last reading instead of 1000 and minus 1000. In another example, I showed you how you can, for example, create a counter, because I want to show you a new thing here. So again, everything that I send in here, these readings go to this change node, and here I set the flow value counter, and here instead of setting it to a specific value, I specified an expression. So this is an expression type, and whenever you are editing the expressions, you have two functions that you can use in order to set or get or read or write flow variables. So there is a function which is called, so everything starts with a $sign. So there is one which is called global context, and the other one is a flow context. So again, it's either the flow or the global variable space. So you can do $ flow context, and in brackets and in double quotes counter. So this is the name of the variable, and you can just say +1. So again, this doesn't work because the value itself doesn't exist, but I can do this with this reset, which just sets the flow counter to 0. So now we can see that we have a 0, and if I start sending in numbers or data, then this gets incremented every time we receive a new data. So this is just a simple counter. Again, if you all want to calculate your average, you need to calculate the number of records that you have received and also the sum of the records, so you can just calculate, let's say, a simple average. The next example is more like a real home automation example. Let's say you want to do a timer-based motion detection. So you have a motion detector which is going to send you two information, whether there is motion or no motion. And for the sake of simplicity, I said that if you have motion, it's going to send a value of 1, and if you don't have a motion, it's going to send you a value of 0. And you want to process this data depending on a counter. Let's say you only want to do something with this motion detection if it's happening between, I don't know, 10 o'clock and midnight. So for this, we can use a timer. So this is not part of the standard set of nodes. It's called the big timer. So you can just install it from the palette. And I specified here that this timer starts at 8 o'clock and then it completes at 11:45. And when it starts, it sends the value of 1, and then when it finishes, it sends the value of 0. And I have saved this value in this timer function. So you can see that I put the current payload into the timer. And actually we can see that the timer is 1 now because we are between 8 o'clock and 11:45. So this is 1, which means that the motion detection is now active. So let's go back to the debug messages. And if I send in a motion, now we can see that the value of 1 is going through. And when we say 0, then it's that information is also going through. So we have created a simple switch node here, which checks the value of the timer. And if it's 1, then it redirects the value to the first port. And if it's 0, so the timer is inactive, then it just doesn't send the data through. So that's how it works. So now we can see that the timer is, the value is 1, so the data is going through. And let's say if I change this one to, so let's say only 9 o'clock, which is already in the past. So we might have to wait a little bit because I think this only triggers, oh no, it says it's only off. So now you can see that the timer is 0. So the timer is deactivated. And now if we go back to the debug messages, so your motion sensor sends you events that motion is detected, but it's not going past this switch node. So your motion detector is inactive. And the last of the example could be like a very, very simple thermostat. So what we need for the thermostat is we need a way to set the required temperature or the set temperature. And we also have an input where we are receiving the temperature data from a temperature sensor. So this is my set temperature. So let's say I can set the temperature between 20 and 25 degrees. But of course you can replace that with, let's say, a UI element where you can type the number or a slider or something like that. But we are going to store this information in a flow variable which is called setTemp. So we put the message.payload into a setTemp. So I can set it, let's say, to 20, and then we can see in the context that we have a set temp of 20. And now let me go back to the debug, because these are the various temperatures we have. So we have the temperatures coming in from the temperature sensor, and then we have the big switch, that's basically the logic of the thermostat. So we check the payload, and if this payload is less than the set temperature, if it's bigger than the set temperature, well, then we have, it's warmer in the room that we need, so we are going to turn off the, let's say, the radiator. And if the temperature is less than the set temperature -1, I added this -1 so we have a little bit of hysteresis, so it doesn't switch on and off constantly around the room temperature, but you can set it to -0.5 or something. Then we need to turn on the heating. So let's say that turning off the heating is, we are just going to send 0. Let's say we send it to a relay, so that's going to turn off the heater. And when we want to turn on the, when we need to turn on the heating, then we just send a 1. So that's like turn something on. And I've also added this filter because now what is going to happen that every time when we receive a temperature reading, then the system is going to send zeros or ones depending on whether it needs to turn on. So let's say if the heating is, or the temperature is low, it's going to send, like every time we receive the temperature reading, it's going to send like 1111. And I just said that, okay, you know, block all the messages that are the same unless they change. So we don't send so many messages to our relay. So the set temperature is now, I think it was 20 degrees. So if it's 18 degrees, then we need to turn on the heating. So again, if I just keep sending 18, we don't get any more ones because of this filter. But then if but the temperature goes to 22 degrees, now it turns off. So if I set the set temperature to 25 now, and if it's still 22 degrees at home, now we can see that we need to turn the heating on. So it goes to on. But then if, let's say, the temperature goes to 27, which is definitely above the set temperature, then it turns off. So that's all you need to program a simple thermostat using these two pieces of information in Node-RED. Well, we haven't really finished with all the examples because I want to talk about a few other things which could be important. So first of all is, let's say you want to delete the context value. So you have a couple of options. I mean, of course, you can use a change value, and then you can just set the flow variable to, let's say, either 0 or like an empty text. It really depends on your scenario. But what you can also do is you can use this one, delete, and then last value. So you put the name of your flow variable here. So that is going to delete it. It's going to act same as the delete button. Again, we have seen previously that sometimes it's better, well, there could be scenarios where it's better that you don't have a flow variable, or maybe it's even better that you have the flow variable, but it's set to a certain default value. So you can do this, you can change it to a default value, or you can use this delete function as well. It's really up to you. The next one I want to talk about is context storage. And that's an important thing because what I haven't really mentioned up until now is that anything you store in the context is stored in the runtime, which means that if you restart your Node-RED, or let's say there is a power outage, so your server goes down and it comes back again, these values will be lost. But there is a way to go around this, because within Node-RED there is a concept of context stores. So by default, everything, so this context store defines how this context information is stored. And the default is that everything is stored in the memory. But you can configure Node-RED so that you have a memory storage and you also have a file storage. So the file storage means that every time you change your context, it's actually written into the file. So when Node-RED starts for the next time, it's going to read the information from the file. So it is going to be persistent. It stays with you when you restart Node-RED. In order to configure this, you have to find your settings.js file, which is usually in your Node-RED installation folder. So you have to edit that file and you have to find the section where it says, this context storage. Probably it is in your settings.js file, but it's commented out. So you need to uncomment it and you have to change it like this. So you say that I define the context storage and I have two options, the memory only and the file, and the default is going to be memory only. And of course, don't forget that if this is in the middle of your context storage, so there is some more stuff under it, then actually you need a comma here, because otherwise it's going to be an invalid JavaScript file and your Node-RED is not going to start. So the comma would be here under the closing curly brackets. And once you change that, obviously you need to restart your Node-RED. But once you restart it, then you have some options. So when I store or when I do anything with the context, either it's a flow or a global, because I have these two different context options, or the context storage is configured, now I have this button here. So here I can specify that I want something to be stored in memory only, or I want to store it in a file. So you can see that it changes from memory only to file, and also here in this sidebar it also shows for every single one where they are stored. So if I refresh my global, and you can see I have, tons of stuff here. Then most of it is memory only, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, for example, these schedules, these are stored in file. So you can use them both at the same time. You just have to make sure that, whenever you want to use a file storage, you have to specify it here because, well, based on the example I've given you, the memory only is the default context storage. And of course, since we have seen these examples, up until now, I showed you how you can store simple numbers and text in the storage, but you can, in the context variable, but you can store anything. It can be arrays and objects and, well, basically, any data type. Yeah, you can see this one is, for example, an object. Up until now, I only showed you how you use the context in simple nodes, for example, in the change node and the switch node, but now we are going to see that how you use it in the function nodes as well. And I'm not going to write, complex or actual examples here, but I'm just going to show you the various options that you can do. And, well, there is only just a few functions that you would need to use. So what do you do if you want to read the context and then just put it into a variable that you can do some manipulation with it within the your function node? So you just define your variable, let's say last value, and then equals, and you do, if you want to read it, you basically say flow.get and then the name of the variable. So that's going to read the value of the flow variable last value and then put it into the last value, let's say local variable. And then let's say if I want to do something with one of my global variable, that's also easy because let me just pick something which is a little bit easier. As I said, I have tons, BT and state. So let my value, of course it doesn't have to be the same. And if you want to read global, then it's just global.get and then btn underscore state. As simple as that. And then from now on, these, last value and my value are going to have the value of these flow and the global variables. Because I talked about storage options, let's see how this looks like when you want to read this not from the memory, but for example for the file. So let me just take another example again. So my access control global variable is stored in the file storage. So let my value to global get access control, and then you can specify the name of the storage option, and then the storage option is stored as a string. So my file storage is called file, so it's double quotes file. And again, if you want the memory only, because this is a default, you don't have to mention anything, so that's fine. Also, it is a good idea, control, okay. Also, it's also a good idea to define a default value. Sometimes it's needed. So let's say if I want this last value, but if it doesn't exist, I want to set it to 0. So I can do that. So let last value equals flow.get last value and then end 0. So I can do this with some basic types. So if you want to default it to a number, you can do that. But the other thing you can do and this is what I do, especially if it's something is an object and I want to set a default object that I want to put it into this section. Actually, let me just change these so you don't get, so that's going to be last value 2 and that's going to be my value 3. So we don't get errors because we use the same variable. So if let's say I want to read this access control variable from the global and also from the file, but let's say this is an object. So I can't just use this end to set a default value. But what I usually do is I check. So if my value is undefined, that means that, so this will execute, this statement will execute if the context variable doesn't exist, because then the global and the flow returns undefined. So let's say that in that case, I want to initialize the, sorry, not the access control, the my value 3. So let's say that in that case, I want to initialize the my value 3 with an empty object. So you just check whether it's undefined. Updating the context is it's very easy. So let me just, I just copied this example above. So this is how we read the value. And if I want to update, then I simply say that, and instead of flow.get, I say flow.set, and I specify the name of the flow variable and then the value. So this is how I write the last value back to the flow. And I can do the same with the global.set. I think it was my value, and then that's it. And if you want this, and if you want to write this value to a specific storage, for example, now on I want to store this btn state in the file context, I can also specify the name of the context. So the name of the context variable, my variable, and then the context storage. And I realize that I should have put this example here. So that's how it looks like properly. And since we are talking about setting the flow values, let me just mention something that I myself only learned recently. Because the way I did my programs is that, let's say I have a function node where I need to use the flow variable, and then I would read it like this, and then I change the last value, and then I would always set it at the end before I finish. But what I learned is that whenever you are reading or getting either the flow or a global, you are not getting a copy of the context, but you get the context itself. So when you make changes to it, it immediately impacts the context. But so you might say that I don't even need to use these set functions, which is technically correct unless you are using the file storage, because only when you call the set functions, then it instructs Node-RED to actually write the changes into the file. So I think, and also it was advised to me that to, get into a habit of using the set functions, because if you omit the set functions and you're using memory only, then no harm is done. But let's say you revisit your code and then you want to change it to file storage, then if you miss the set functions in the beginning, you probably won't remember the points where you want to save the information. So I guess it's better just to use the set functions, because then you can just easily come back here, find all your global or flow set functions, and you can just add the context storage if you need to change that at a later point. And then finally, my last example, if you want to delete your context from a function node, then, actually, the example is here, is let's say flow .set. So we are still using the set function, and let's say last value, and then the last is undefined. So that's going to do the same as you would press the delete button here. And then finally, the last thing that I referred to right in the beginning of this section is, what is this node context? And the node context is something that you use in a function node. So in the function node, you can use flow.set or global.set, and you can obviously use this in the change node as well. But in the function node, you also have context.get, and you also have and this should go into a variable, my value 5, and you also have context.set last value, and let's say my value 5. So this this will create a context variable which is only visible for this function node, and those would be visible up here in this area. And this is great because I mean, I use this a lot because if I have a function node which processes messages, and again, it needs to store some information for something, you know, for a message that comes in later, then if all the processing is done within this function node, there is no point putting it into the flow and making it visible for everything else. I think it's just much better to keep the scope as small as possible. So if I want to store a data which is only going to be used here, I would use the context. So it only visible by the function node, and then, you know, processing data. So for example, if I'm creating a function node which calculates the minimum and the maximum and the average, I would store all the information in the node because you know, those intermediate data would not need to be visible for other nodes. So I just put everything into the context. If I have anything that I need to put into the flow or the global because that's data that should be visible or useful for other, you know, parts of the flow as well, I can, you know, store some of them in the context, and I can put something else in the flow or a global as well. You know, it's really up to you. But that's the difference between the context values for the function node and the flows and the globals, which could be used by anything else. And finally, I do have some reminder here which says what are the don'ts. So when you should not be using the context, you should not be using the context if you want to store something on that message that you want to use later on. So something which is specific to that message that you want to use later on. And that's actually related to the second comment here, because when you are using the context, so you put something into the context, and let's say in a change node or in a function node, then if another message comes through, then obviously that is going to override the changes. So maybe you have a scenario where you have the message comes in, you put the value of that message into the flow variable in a change node, and you do something else, and then later on the flow you are reading that. But you cannot be certain that by the time the processing comes to your second, let's say, change node or function node, another message doesn't come in which would override the original message. So this is why I said that if you want to just use the context as a temporary storage for message specific information, you shouldn't really be using that. And of course, if you want to do something like that, because let's say there is something that you want to store in the beginning that you want to use it later on, and that's specific to each of the messages, you should be putting it onto the message as well. So obviously not in the payload, because the payload is getting overwritten by every single node, but you can put it into, let's say, message.save. So another object within the message object, not the payload itself, because by default, each of the nodes that the message goes through, it should only, modify the payload or some other specific attributes. For example, the file node is going to use the message.file name if you want to specify the file name externally. But if you put anything else, it would just ignore it and then it pass it through the node. So it would change the message. It would use use the payload in order to do the processing and put the results usually in the payload as well. But any other part of the message object is going to get unchanged. So you can use that to store message instead of using the context. Mostly because you can't really be sure that if you have a lot of messages coming through, the subsequent message is not going to override the data by the time you want to process it later on in the flow. I know this was a little bit complicated, especially if you are a beginner and you just want to understand the basics, but I wanted to include all of this in a single video. But that should be the end of it. So let's recap what we have learned today. And let's recap what we learned in this video. We definitely learned what is the context in Node-RED and how you can use it. We learned how you can pass information into the store and how you can, store information in between messages. And then we learned the various options that we can use in context storage. Well, two the main options that are probably going to be the most frequently used. And hopefully we understood this whole concept using a couple of examples, and these examples were on standard nodes, so like using the switch and the change node, but we also learned how we use the context in the function nodes as well. So that will be all for today. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.